Hi, I'm Matthew Hibert, and this is the second of a series of lectures that I'm recording on education for democracy. This presentation is entitled Teaching Democratic Culture by Democratizing Education, and it's focusing on the experiential side of learning. So the previous presentation focused mostly on the content, what kinds of things do we want to teach in democratic education. This one is talking about how do we organize the schooling context so that students are developing the culture of democracy rather than just learning about it. Okay? So I'd like to start with a reflection like I did the last time. In this reflection, I'd like you to think about your own schooling experiences. What aspects of that experience were democratic in nature and what aspects were decidedly more authoritarian? Many schools are really very much established around authoritarian principles, which creates an interesting contradiction in terms of education for democracy. And that contradiction can have some fairly important consequences in the political socialization of students. So for the overview of this presentation, we'll consider it in 4 parts. We'll start by talking about why does a democratic classroom matter? Then we'll look at what do we mean by creating a democratic context, followed by democratizing the educational experience, which we'll discuss in 3 terms, and considerations for different levels of the education system. So to start, the culture in the classroom. Why does a democratic classroom matter? And to start here, I'd like to run a little thought experiment in education. Okay? So I'd like you to imagine a child learning in an authoritarian classroom versus a child in an open and participatory classroom. We'll start with the former. The child in the authoritarian classroom spends most of her day sitting, listening to lectures. She learns not to ask questions or to stand out. She learns a respect for authority that is largely based on fear, and with this, a discipline which is based on rules and punishments. She learns, over time, to be quiet, obedient, passive, and complacent. The child in the open and participatory classroom, on the other hand, cultivates a very different way of interacting with the world around her. She spends her days actively engaged in asking and answering questions. She's solving problems, working collaboratively, and taking initiative. And this has huge consequences for the way that she develops, and the extent to which she is willing and able to put forward an opinion, to take initiative, to organize with her peers, and to think and act autonomously. Okay? So consider these different schooling contexts, and regardless of whether or not the 2 students were learning the same curriculum, regardless of how committed their teachers were, just based on that different approach to teaching, that different type of classroom climate, the experience and consequently the learning is going to be very different. And I'm not talking so much about the cognitive learning, about the knowledge that they gain, but more about how they develop as people. So this presentation is really looking at learning as an enculturation process, and enculturation in the classroom in particular, because this is where students spend most of their day. And so a helpful way to think about it is to consider how the individual is situated in the society and how this is analogous to the student being situated in the school system. Now, what happens in the school system operates at several levels. So you have system level policies, and then you have school structures, and there's leadership at the school that make decisions on which what happens in the classroom is based. And inside the classroom, you have a teacher who is mediating the school experience for the students. Now, of course, the student, in this diagram, it looks like the student is trapped in some kind of a jail. We know that's not the case. The student is interacting at the school level. They're influencing the system to some extent, as are the teachers. So these levels are not, it's not just a top-down approach. The student is also pushing back, as is the teacher, as is the school. So there's a lot of interaction between the levels. But this diagram is set up to reflect this idea that while the teacher has some autonomy in the classroom, they're also constrained to some extent by what's happening at the school and the system level. And all of that has effects for the student. Okay? Now, if we think back to that thought experiment, and you have the authoritarian classroom and the open and participatory classroom, you can sort of get the sense of what's happening in those 2 classrooms as being a function of sort of the mandate at the system level and the type of school leadership, and then the personality and approach of the two teachers taken in the two classrooms. Now, I want to talk a little bit about curriculum as immersion, or immersion as curriculum. We don't think about curriculum in that way very often. We usually think about curriculum as kind of the content to be taught. But there's no arguing the fact that the student spending day after day, year after year in the classroom is learning to some extent from that experience, and the way the classroom is set up, the way the school is set up, is having an influence. So what do we mean by democratizing that experience and creating a democratic classroom context, rather? Well, the conceptual approach for this is sort of based in response to the conventional approach to teaching, which is you have a student, you have a teacher teaching the thing that's taught, and that thing that's taught gets sort of transmitted or deposited in the head of the student each day. Now, this is a very straightforward linear approach, and I would say that it still tends to dominate educational thinking in most school systems around the world, even though it contradicts a lot of what the current brain research and so on about how students learn, as well as theories and philosophies of education that have been around for a long time, like the inquiry approach, critical pedagogy, and so on. There's a strong basis for framing education differently, but this is still the conventional wisdom on what teaching is and how it's done. Now, contrast this with an approach where student is being influenced by a variety of factors, not just one. And this is what I want to talk about in this presentation. And I call it immersion as curriculum. So the student is immersed every day in a schooling environment in which there are all of these different factors that are influencing them day after day, pounding on the students, right? And the student is being socialized in response to them. Again, it's not, those arrows are pointing towards the students because that's a kind of influence. Now, it's not one directional. These are all interactive, and the student is interacting with all of these factors, and there are transactions that are happening cognitively and through the experience of the student. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to get at in this diagram is the idea that education is, in fact, a function of all of these things, irregardless of what the former curriculum might state. It's not just, you don't just go to school to learn math and science and language. There's all of this other learning that is a result of different factors that aren't written down anywhere in the textbook, and often not even articulated in the curriculum mandate. Okay. Now, what's interesting with these factors is that when you start to look at them more closely, you can see a split. Only a small number of those factors actually have to do with the explicit content, the kind of stuff that we usually think about as being taught. Okay? The majority of these factors relate to the context in which that formal, explicit teaching takes place. Now, these factors are tacit and they're indirect, but they're nonetheless influential on the student experience. So if we can look at, back to this diagram of the student in the nested system, and we can look at their experience as being a function of both the content that is taught and the context in which they're living day after day. And we separate those factors out, focusing on the contextual factors and putting the two systems together. And you can break those contextual factors down further into social factors, material, and institutional. So the social factors refer to things like relationships, interactions, and the language that the students are being exposed to day after day. Those are all kind of social factors. And again, the distinctions between these different categories are somewhat artificial, and the boundaries are soft. But nonetheless, it still is useful in structuring our thinking to have the different categories. It just helps to sort of frame things. It's a lens for looking at what happens in the classroom, rather than a definitive list or structure. Okay? We have also institutional factors, things like the policies, procedures, the frameworks, and standards. So these are kind of like you have the physical structure of the class of the school, the school building and so on, but you also have this institutional structure, all of these hidden things that are these are the architecture of the experience of the students, and there's no question that these things really have a huge impact on the daily experience of students, the ways of doing things in the school, the way the school day is set up, and so on. Okay. Then we have also the physical and material factors, the objects in the environment, the physical structure of the building, the use of space in the classroom, the hands-on manipulatives, and so on. Okay. So putting all of those factors together, and again, not trying to exclude the content, but the content was already talked about in a previous presentation. This will focus on the three aspects of the schooling experience. So I'd like to start with the social factors. How can we democratize the social experiences of students? And the social factors were, again, these kinds of things here. So things like the parental involvement in the school, role modeling, every adult in the classroom is to some extent a role model. So the question is, what kind of role modeling is taking place? What does the school leadership look like? How are the peer relations? So on. So what's meant by this social factors? These are factors of the social experiences of students. They include all of the relationships, not just student-student relationships, but also relationships between students and teachers, between teachers and the administration, because all of these relationships teach students subtle lessons about how society is organized and how people should interact with one another. So through observing these kinds of relationships, they develop the concept of what normal relationships are, right? And other social phenomena such as language, role modeling, and so on. How can democratic values and principles be reinforced in the social experience? Well, think about what democratic values and principles are and how these relate to social phenomena. And certain values and principles of democracy really come to the forefront, such as equality. So encouraging equality and dialogue in relations. A lot of what happens in democracy is about dialogue or debate or discussion, deliberation. So we want to have a lot of that happening in the students' experiences. We want to encourage linkages between students and the school and the home and the community. We don't want the school as this isolated institution that's not part of real life. No, we want to have students understand that what's going on in the school is continuous with their experience outside of the school. So the more linkages between home and community and school, the better. Making participation and engagement normal. So if the daily experience of students is a passive one, where their main job is to sit, be quiet, and listen, well, they're learning something from that. And it's not just the stuff that's coming into their ears. They're learning that their role in society is to be quiet, passive, complacent, listen to instructions, listen to authority. Okay? So we want to cultivate something more engaging from students. We also want to cultivate understanding and respect. So we want to be encouraging respectful interactions, understanding of differences, and so on. And we want students to recognize different assumptions, different perspectives. And we want steady exposure to democratic ideals. So the more we can embody those democratic ideals in the social interactions of the school, the better the learning, the more students will start to internalize this as what's normal and expected in their behavior as adults. So what kind of activities and processes support this kind of social experience? Well, any kind of student-centered experience is going to be conducive to this. Things like dialogue, discussion, and debate, participatory and experiential activities, any kind of hands-on activity, authentic problem solving. So giving students real-life problems to try and tackle, or having them come up with problems, issues that are related to the content. We recognize that teachers have content that they must teach, but getting students to come up with problems or questions that are related to that, and then following through and seeking answers, that will be very empowering to students, and that's something that's valuable, right? Anything that's collaborative is going to be conducive, because this is really how democracies function and get, democratic citizens get things done by organizing, by learning how to work together to solve the problems of things that matter to them. So we want to start students in the school days with learning how to do that in a structured and safe environment like a school, so that as adults they're capable of doing so. Community-based activities, so getting students, when possible and appropriate, outside of the school and into the community, getting them involved in the community, getting them more familiar with their community and the adults and the different roles of the different institutions in their community, and so on. Now, consider, for example, how democratic values and principles can be reflected in the following social factors. Let's start with pedagogical approaches. So things like, if we start by thinking about what is an authoritarian pedagogy, well, an authoritarian pedagogy would be sit and be quiet and listen to my lecture, right? What would be more democratic? Well, pretty much anything, but working with questions, asking students questions, having students pose questions back to you, getting them to debate and discuss the content, having them pose questions and pursue their own learning by using various classroom resources. These are all more engaging, more democratic teaching approaches. Think also about the role modeling. So you as a teacher or you as a parent, how are you embodying democratic ideals? Do you care about your community? Are you acting on that care? Do you talk about that with the students? And you know, students, especially young students, they naturally look up to adults. I mean, this is possibly biologically programmed into them. I mean, students learn by observing, and they learn a great deal by observing. And so to know that the adults that are important in their lives, their parents and their students, care about the community, are working to better the community, are tolerant, are accountable, are transparent in the way that they do things, are interested in what other people have to say and respectful of what other people have to say. So if the adults in the students' lives are embodying those things, students are going to pick that up. And there's a very strong likelihood of them gaining more of those qualities themselves through exposure to adults that matter to them, acting in that way. Now, peer relations as well, and this is an area where students often need help, because there will be, you know, many students they haven't learned strategies for coping with people that are interacting with them in you know, violent ways or harsh ways, and so you often get little squabbles happening between students. And so the adults that are present in their lives need to help those students, those children, to learn how to discuss, to learn how to use nonviolent language, to learn how to be patient and, you know, express how they feel, but without targeting or picking on somebody else. And with, you know, if you have students of, let's say, a minority group in your classroom or a group that's getting picked on, help the other students to be respectful and courteous of those. And you don't want to do this in a top-down domineering way. You want to help students to empathize. You know, one of the greatest qualities that students can learn in school is that of empathy. To empathize with the other people in their lives, to learn what the world must be like through their eyes, and that will help them to in turn treat them with respect. Right? The language, terminology, and vocabulary that the students are exposed to in the classroom is also important. So if students are being exposed to, you know, terms like negotiable, you know, they learn that some things in their life are negotiable. Some things may not be negotiable, but if they learn this term, they will learn to then ask the question, well, is that something that's negotiable? Is that something that we can discuss? I'd like to discuss this with you because I don't feel really comfortable with this. The kind of vocabulary and the kind of openness to asking questions that students are exposed to day after day will really matter a lot. We can think of language as a kind of cognitive scaffolding. The language is the way in which we think about the world. It's the way in which we manipulate abstract thoughts. And so learning new vocabulary that's related to democracy can be, you know, empowering for students, and it can help them to see the world in a new way. So making that vocabulary normal in their life is helpful for them in terms of democratic enculturation. Relationships with parents and other teachers, school leaders. So consider not only the peer relations, but you as an adult, whether a parent or a teacher, how are you interacting with other adults, and what are students learning from that? Right? Next, I'd like to talk about institutional factors. So how can we make our educational institutions, policies, and processes more democratic? Institutional factors include things like policies, procedures, frameworks, standards, including things like the legal environment, the way the school is managed, school governance, and so on. So what do we mean by this? The institutional arrangements of the schooling, the frameworks, policies, procedures, standards, mandates, governance mechanisms, established practices and norms. So some of this is formal, it's written down. Some of it's informal, it's just the way things are done. You know, this is the way our school operates. It's nonetheless important because students respond to that. You know, it doesn't take, even a young student, it doesn't take them long to learn what's what, to learn how things are done. And you know, if I have to get a drink of water, or if I have to go to the washroom, what do I do? Do I raise my hand? Do I just get up and walk out of the classroom? If I have a question, am I allowed to just speak that out, or do I have to raise my hand, or should I run over and tug on the pant leg of the teacher to ask the question? What do I do? And students pick up on all of these things very quickly. They learn how to get things done. So the question for us as democratic educators is, how do we democratize these factors in a way that's going to, to be conducive to democratic learning, but also to the functioning of our school? Question?
In your past experience in schools that have actually instituted more democratic procedures in that sense, what is the process they usually have to follow to do that, and how arduous of a process does it tend to be? I mean, obviously it depends from school to school, but what are the factors involved there?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the process of transforming a school from an authoritarian school to a democratic school is a long one, and I think it's an ongoing one, because democracy is an ideal that is probably never realized in full, right? So it's kind of an ongoing transformation. It often starts in the classroom with pedagogy. The reason for that, I think, is we have education systems that are set up in a very authoritarian manner, but there's a lot of research, especially sort of in the last couple of decades, about how students learn best, and that research points towards the effectiveness of more student-centered teaching methods. And so student-centered teaching methods are naturally more democratic, they're more dialogical, and so those kind of changes often start at the school level, at the classroom level through the teaching processes. But it doesn't take long if you're doing democratic practice in the classroom. It doesn't take long for that to start to influence the way school leadership is being done. Because school leaders are usually pretty with it, intelligent people, and they realize that if I'm expecting my teachers to have democratic classrooms and to respect the opinion of students, then it's not real right if I don't care at all about what the teachers think about how the school, they want to manage the school in a more participatory way as well. And so then you often do sort of get a filtering upwards of the democratic ideals. And it is a difficult transition, but I think the verdict is fairly clear that democratic governance is a fairly effective way of governing, and that applies to countries just as well as to schools, just as well as to businesses, right? Because the person at the top of whatever pyramid in terms of hierarchies isn't the only person that's smart, isn't the only person that has good ideas. And when we can benefit, treat people a little bit more equally, make processes a little bit more deliberative, have more discussion, more participation, you often end up getting more effective governance, right? And so, often when you read reports of best practices in school management, well, lo and behold, if those don't look pretty democratic. And so it is a process that takes time. It often starts at the classroom level, but there's a good body of literature out there now around democratic school management methods and so on as well. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay, so how can democratic values and principles be reinforced institutionally? Well, I think it probably starts with a critical analysis of what the values and principles are on which institutional structures are currently based. And with scrutiny, I think we'd have to admit that in many cases, most of the governance structures of our education systems, even in established democracies, are fairly authoritarian. They don't really stand up to a critical analysis from a democratic perspective. And I'm talking here not only about the values and principles that exist, but also those which don't. We need to think about not only the policies that we have, but also what policies don't we have? What policies are we missing? What policies should we have if we really care about equality, if we really care about social justice? So we need to look at what's there and also what's not yet there. We also need to look at governance structures that reflect democratic ideals, values, principles. So things like transparency and accountability in our school management and in our school system management, equality, rights, social justice, and so on. What kinds of activities and processes support this kind of institutional experience? Well, demonstrating transparency and accountability as well as fairness throughout the system, deliberative processes at all levels, encouraging participation and engagement at all levels, okay? And cultivating autonomy and personal responsibility as well, okay? And it's not difficult to see the relationship of all of these factors to democracy as well as to how we might transform institutional structures. Okay? Where can democratic values and principles be reflected in the following kinds of things? How about our discipline systems? You know, this is one of the very clearly coercive aspects of school management structures, discipline systems. Students get to know what the rules are. They often don't have a say in what the rules are, and they know what the consequences are for violating those rules. So how might we transform this? Well, of course, we need to have some kind of an agreement of how students need to behave, right? Well, what about involving students in the process of determining what that looks like? So asking students, what kind of expectations should we have of one another in this classroom? You know, we're all here to learn. So this is our learning environment. So how do we need to behave in order for all of us to be able to learn effectively together? You know, we're stuck here from whatever the hours are, 8 o'clock until 3 o'clock every day. How are we going to get along with one another? What kind of things do we need to do? What kind of things do we need to make sure we don't do? What are the appropriate ways to interact with each other? So ask students that. You know, one of the really effective ways, and this is pretty common practice in a lot of places, is to, rather than the teacher imposing rules, start off the school year by talking to the students about it and together, collectively, coming up with not even a set of rules, but a classroom agreement. This is our agreement. This is our constitution in this classroom. Okay, and then you know, following along from that, what to do in cases where students are not fulfilling their responsibilities according to that agreement, according to that constitution. And you know, it doesn't mean that we do away with discipline systems altogether, but what I'm getting at here is we can set this up in a way that better involves students, in a way that students take more ownership for it. And often, along with this, you get students responding better to it because it's something that they have a vested interest in. It's something that they helped to create and helped care about. So you get students using positive peer pressure, encouraging one another to behave in accordance with this because it's something that they own and they care about. It's not something imposed on them. And that feels really different to students. Okay. School procedures, in the same way, you know, the more we can involve students in determining the school procedures, the better, the more reflective these procedures are of democratic ideals, of equality, of fairness, and so on, the better. Classroom routines, similarly. How about assessment and reporting practices? Well, this is an interesting one because this is also often very authoritarian, and assessment is one of the main focuses of a lot of education systems. Unfortunately, it's become a preoccupation. And it ends up being used as almost like a sorting mechanism, basically telling students, okay, you're okay to move on to the next level of society, and you, unfortunately, you're not. You're stuck at this level. It's something that creates tremendous pressure for students. It's something that creates tremendous competition between students, and none of these things are very helpful for real quality functioning democracies. So how can we transform that? Well, for classroom teachers, there's little you can do about the big standardized assessments, except to help students to prepare for it and to sort of reframe the importance that they give to that. But you can do a lot in terms of assessment within the classroom by involving students, for example, in asking students to generate test questions that potential test questions, write down questions that they think would be good questions to demonstrate learning against. Okay, it doesn't mean you have to use all of those questions in generating tests, but getting students to think about what could be tested, it's helpful to the students, and it also helps them to feel like they're having a little bit more voice in how they're being assessed as well. Another thing to do is to consider getting students involved in self-assessment or peer assessment. Okay, and I don't just mean about content knowledge. I'm talking about qualitative things as well, even things like students' personal responsibility. You could work with students to discuss what do we mean by personal responsibility, how should we be behaving, what kind of dispositions and attributes should we be demonstrating, and what are the criteria for measuring that, and then ask students to write write a page on how well they think they're doing in relation to those criteria. basically assessing themselves. Because assessment is beautiful for one thing, in that it allows us to put attention into certain key areas. So whatever areas we think are important, we want to be targeting those to some extent in our assessment criteria, in our assessment processes, to draw attention to them. So similarly with reporting practices, if we care about democracy and democratic ideals, well, we need to honestly ask ourselves where we are including those ideals in our assessment practices, in our reporting practices. Okay? Similarly with decision-making processes, again, we want to be letting students feel like they have a voice, and not just a token voice, but like a meaningful voice. So we recognize that it's difficult in most contexts for students to be governed purely by the students. There are certain things that are mandated, and you need to always be conscious of things like student safety. So we can't just have students arbitrarily and freely making up all of their rules in most cases. But we do want to within the scope of what's reasonable, give students meaningful and authentic choices. Maybe that's something simple. Maybe that's giving them voice about how we're going to do certain things in the classroom. What the important thing is that they have a sense of feeling like they're involved in decision-making processes periodically, and that their voice means something. Okay? If we give them a voice, but then we just dismiss their voice, then that's counterproductive. That lets them feel like, why would I bother even giving you my opinion because you don't care? So we want to be careful what we ask for and when we ask for. And when we ask for it, we want to take their opinions seriously in our decisions. The third area of the educational experience that I want to talk about is the physical and material factors that comprise that experience. What role can the physical environment play in norming democratic values and principles? And by physical factors, I'm talking about things like the physical object, the use of space, the visual environment, and so on. So what do we mean by this? Physical environment in which schooling takes place, both inside and outside the classroom, the visual environment and the use of wall space, the object, materials, and learning resources that students interact with. Okay? So how can we make use democratic values and principles to reinforce democracy in the physical environment? Well, we want to make the physical environment conducive to democratic relations, things like sharing materials, discussion, and collaboration. So what I'm hinting at there is really the physical arrangement of the classroom, things like the arrangement of desks. There's a real sort of value embedded in how we position students in the classroom. And if we have a student standing at the front of the classroom with students arranged in rows, well, this has a lot of sort of baggage attached to it. It says to students, they're all facing the front. That's where the authority stands. It's not conducive to interaction. So it's telling students their job is to sit, be quiet, not interact with one another. Okay? Empowering students regarding their physical environment. So we want to be giving them choices occasionally, and again, within the scope of what's reasonable. We want to make the use of some spaces negotiable. So possibly, maybe that's a portion of the wall space that's for student displays, but we want to be giving students some kind of sense of power or control. We want to give them a sense of ownership as well and responsibility. So maybe this involves getting students help in caring for the classroom. Right? What kinds of activities, processes facilitate a democratic physical environment? Well, transparency, transparent processes and functional approaches for seating arrangements. If we sit students in groups as opposed to rows, well, the groups, that's conducive to collaboration, to interaction between the students. Maybe that's not always ideal. Maybe in some cases we do want them seated in rows so that they can't really interact. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with doing that sometimes, but the key word in this point is functional. So based on the activity that we're doing, how is it best to arrange the physical space in the classroom? For certain activities, maybe we want all of the desks arranged in a horseshoe shape or in a circle, sometimes in clusters, sometimes in rows, maybe sometimes in lines. If we're doing a debate, maybe we want one row of desks on one side and one row on another side so that the two sides are facing one another. So think about this not as something static that's locked in, but something flexible that can be used differently. And this will in turn help students to think about the way in which they can arrange the physical environment themselves for different purposes. Okay? Giving students ownership and control over certain spaces, involving students in decisions about how space is used, and democracy-related visual messaging. So consider what's up on the walls and how what's up on the walls relates to the principles of democracy. So, I'm not talking about indoctrination here, but it would be nice to have, for example, in a younger age classroom, maybe you have some kind of a display celebrating certain virtues like respect, okay? And maybe the students are doing work that's related to that. This kind of thing where the things that are bombarding students' eyes on a day-to-day basis have some kind of a meaningful relationship to the kind of development we want to see in them, right? Now, consider where democratic values and principles can be reflected in the following: seating and desk arrangements, I've already talked about that. The visual environment and wall space, again. Learning materials and technology. So with learning materials, consider, for example, if we're giving students materials to learn with, are they going to be sharing those materials? Is it something that is shareable? If it's not something that's very shareable, then we need to make sure we have enough of it so that students don't end up in competition for the scarce resource. Same thing with technology. How are we going to be using technology? And what is the relationship? Is that just, are students receiving information from that? Or is it more interactive? Is it empowering for the students? Same with teacher materials. It's fine for teachers to have their own space in the classroom, the teacher's desk, or this is the board that the teacher writes on and students shouldn't touch it. It's okay to have certain rules like that. Democracies aren't anarchies. There are rules that need to be followed. But to have some of that negotiated and to give students a sense of what are the parameters and the expectations for their behavior, and what are the boundaries, what can be negotiated and what can't. Okay? And the use of outdoor spaces, community, and so on. We want students to be linking their learning inside the school with their life and learning outside of the school. And so the more we can make that bridge by the way we teach, the better. In terms of implications for the school system then, there are implications for all different levels of educational professionals. I've been talking mostly about the school, the classroom level. But if you recall back to our nested system, we've got the different levels. We've got the classroom level, the school level, and the system level. And these different factors, which I've just been talking about, all fall into these different categories. So depending on what level of the school system an education professional is working at, they need to consider what within the scope of their job has political importance and how can that be reoriented to support democratic ideals. Same thing for parents within the home. Within the scope of your role as a parent, how can you arrange things so that my child's experience is one that's conducive to developing the democratic ideals? Key considerations for democratic classrooms: use democratic, student-centered teaching strategies, give students practice with democratic activities in a safe and caring context. One interesting way of thinking about learning at school is, rather than asking yourself, what are students learning each day? Ask what they're practicing each day. If the main thing they're practicing is sitting, listening, well, we're kind of in trouble in terms of developing democratic citizens, aren't we? If they're practicing debate, discussion, well, that's a little bit more positive. If they're practicing collaboration, again, that's helpful. Okay, so think about what students are doing on a daily basis, because what they're doing will, over time, become habit. Over time, it will become internalized. Help students establish democratic values and principles as normal. So they should have the expectation of, for example, transparency and accountability for those that are in decision-making positions. Balance structure and freedom in the management of the classroom. Like I said, democracies are not anarchies. It's okay to have rules, it's okay to have order, but balance that. Create structures that allow students to have freedom within certain parameters and let them feel empowered and have that boundary be a little bit negotiable. Key considerations at the school level. Be open and transparent in school governance, model democratic leadership, and involve students and teachers as appropriate in school governance. So many democratic schools will have a teacher council that provides input into decision making. Many also have a student council where the students have a voice in decision making. That's not to say that students set the rules or make the decisions, but they have a voice. And again, we want to make sure that that voice is meaningful. We don't want to create this structure of a student council and then have it mean nothing. That's counterproductive. So,
when schools create student councils for the first time,
yeah.
Are there any problems that they tend to run into, or any kind of growing pains that they tend to run up against?
It's not something that I've studied in depth, but I just thinking through it myself and looking at my own experiences, there is tendency for student councils to be a popularity contest. So that the more popular, more charismatic students end up getting elected to the student council, even if they may not necessarily have the best ideas or the most valuable things to say. Now, one could argue that this is similar to elections in established democracies as well, right? I mean, it tends to be the charismatic, those that are good with networking. I'd say the real challenge, though, apart from this sort of tendency towards popularity contest, is to structure it in a way that will let students all feel that it's fair, that it's meaningful, and then, for those that are in the authority position at the school level to actually follow through and make this something meaningful. Because sometimes student councils are initiated by students or are initiated by one well-meaning teacher without, that maybe the school leader, the school principal will say, okay, yeah, sure, let's do it. But actually they're not really fully prepared to give students a meaningful voice, in which case that just leads to frustration, right? If students get all organized and they have this whole process and present ideas, and then there ends up being no real voice or no real impact, well, it's a recipe for frustration, and it's a recipe for apathy ultimately, right? Yeah. Strive to bridge the school with the home and community context. Encourage student and support teachers in embracing democratic values. Again, we want the teachers to be thinking and acting democratically as well. So at the school level, school leaders need to be considering that. Now at the system level, you want to be collecting and analyzing student data to identify inequities, things like inequities in access and quality, to make sure that the school system is actually working towards supporting social justice. Establish policies which mitigate against social injustices in the system. So if you have real inequalities, what are you doing about that? How seriously are you taking that? Prioritize transparency, accountability, and participation. And ensure that formal curricula include attention to democracy and related issues. Okay, so somewhere within the formal curricula, that doesn't mean you need a subject that's called democracy or even a subject that's called political science. What it means is that somewhere within the curriculum, we are incorporating these democratic values, principles, and substantive issues into the discussion so that students, upon graduation, will have a good foundation in this. Okay? Yes?
So in terms of something specific, what is one way, in terms of gender equality, for example,
yeah.
Can you show what that would look like in terms of the social factors and the institutional factors, and then the more physical space-related factors, especially in a context that doesn't kind of advance gender equality?
Yeah, it can be a difficult issue and a sensitive issue, and it's one that, I can't speak specifically to a given cultural context necessarily, but I'll give you a few little examples of gender-related policies and activities. In a lot of countries, there's a real gender disparity in education. Children drop out of education earlier, don't have the same level of achievement, and there are a variety of social factors related to that. In many of these cases, there are programs like scholarship programs that have been implemented to encourage girls to go on to higher levels of schooling. Stipend programs that encourage girl students to attend school regularly. So there are these kind of policies that you can argue for or against them, but they're just examples of measures that have been taken by governments to help remediate this issue of inequality. At the classroom level, certainly there are content, like you want to be thinking about things like, do the textbooks reflect gender stereotypes? And in terms of our socio-cultural context, is it time for us to start challenging some of those stereotypes? And I'm not saying it is or it isn't in any given culture. I'm just saying this should be a question that gets discussed. How willing are we to challenge? How ready are we to challenge these gender stereotypes and problematize those stereotypes in our classrooms? a lot of classrooms are also segregated, either entirely segregated where you have boys' classes and girls' classes, or partially segregated where you have, you might have one classroom, but the boys are on one side and the girls are on the other side, and they're not interacting with one another. That creates an interesting context in terms of gender equality, because when it has a big impact on the gender norms and the way in which boy students and girl students interact with one another, and in many cases they don't interact at all. And so we need to consider this in the way that we're talking to students about gender roles and so on as well, and how I'm not saying that teachers should be challenging this, because in a lot of communities, a teacher would get themselves into serious trouble if they tried forcing students to mix within the classroom, right? The parents wouldn't tolerate it, and the principal may not tolerate it. So I'm not saying that they should or they shouldn't be challenging this in a really active and aggressive way, but there are some more tacit, quieter ways. There's a body of literature around gender responsive teaching, for example, in which teachers are basically just more attuned to gender issues in their classroom and are responsive to the ways in which girls versus boys learn. There are gender differences in the way that they learn, as well as encouraging the groups that may be more quiet to participate a little bit more, maybe giving more voice to girl students if the girl students are less active in the classroom and so on. So these kinds of things. Okay, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that brings us roundabout to the end of the presentation. I'd like to close with another reflection here. I'd like to ask a series of questions. What are the most democratic aspects of the schooling experience for students today in your country, in your context? What are the most authoritarian aspects of their experience? And are there any which would be relatively easy to infuse with democratic values and principles? And this sort of comes back to the gender question that was posed easier. Oftentimes there are issues that are more or less sensitive, and one of the ones that tends to be particularly sensitive in a lot of countries is the gender question. So that may not be the easiest issue to tackle most immediately. Maybe in terms of introducing democratic values and principles, there might be other areas that are a little bit more fruitful, where there's more receptivity, more openness to exploring that. And so you might want to think about, if I want to encourage democracy in my classroom, what are the quick wins? What's going to be the easiest way for me to get started with this? And then over time, we hope that people will become open and interested in more robust approaches, more holistic approaches to democracy. But to think about what might be the easiest places to get started with this. Okay. Any other question? Okay. Well, thank you.
اگر بارها دنبال واژه آموزش گشته اید ولی با درهای بسته روبرو شده اید، اگر دنبال آموزشکده‌ای گشته اید که دور نباشد و استادهای خوبی هم داشته باشد، اگر مشتاق آموختن هستید اما توانایی مالی کافی نداشته اید که بیشتر و بیشتر بخوانید و بدانید، اگر شبها وقت آزاد دارید و روزها نمیتوانید دنبال درس و کلاس بروید، توانا بهترین انتخاب شماست. توانا بود هر که دانا بود. توانا رایگان در اختیار شماست. آموزشکده‌ای در خانه شماست. هر وقت که بخواهید، شب یا روز. با درس‌هایی مانند حق و حقوق زنان، دموکراسی، تفسیرهای نوین و لیبرال از دین، حقوق اقلیت‌ها، حکومت قانون، نهادسازی و نهادهای مدنی، محیط زیست، روزنامه نگاری و امنیت فضای مجازی و موبایل‌های هوشمند. آموزشکده توانا کلاس‌های دلخواه شما را رایگان به منزل شما می‌آورد. در کلاس‌های توانا با نام و جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. برای ما مهم انگیزه شهروندی و علاقه شما به آموختن است. ما هرگز نام واقعی شما را نمی‌پرسیم. تیم فنی توانا از طریق سایت تواناتک به شما کمک می‌کند تا با خیال راحت و فارغ از دردسرهای امنیت وب در کلاس‌ها شرکت کنید. در توانا بیاموزید، با تواناتک پاسخ سوالهای فنی خود را بگیرید و از صدها کتاب، ویدئو، آدیو و مدرک دیجیتال در کتابخانه توانا رایگان استفاده کنید. توانا پنجره آشنایی شما با جهان ایده‌های نو و تجربه مردم دیگر کشورها در گذار به دموکراسی. برای دسترسی به توانا و اطلاعات بیشتر به فیسبوک، توییتر، یوتیوب و گوگل پلاس توانا و تواناتک بپیوندید.